Hi, everyone. Let me start first to say I'm very excited to be part of moderating this panel with a group of esteemed professionals, colleagues, and definitely people who are currently making a lot of change in the market. Today's topic, as Zili was saying, is about corporate restructuring and converting pitfalls into opportunities. Quite a wide topic, so I think the best thing is to do is maybe to break it down and to break this topic into 3 areas. And we start addressing, I guess, the corporate restructuring, understanding actually more the development we're seeing actually in the market. Then we're going to be talking more on the challenges faced by the corporates, but as well when it comes to the restructuring process and insolvency process as well. And we're going to end it with a bright note on the opportunities that we're seeing actually in the market, and we're going to hear from all of our panelists coming from various backgrounds. So let's start with the corporate restructuring, I guess, and the market. We set this scene a little bit. A lot of us have been in the region for a very long time, and I think it's good to understand how have the restructuring and insolvency markets changed in the last 10 years. Matthew, I'm looking at you. You've been in the region for a very long time, so you can give us more insight and your point of view, I guess, share your view on the market.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I've been in the region doing restructurings for a decade. So saw the back end of the global financial crisis and what it did to the region, and then seen the slump and now seeing a little bit more of activity coming through. I think there have been three sort of mega trends, if you can call it that, of what's been happening in the market. The first one is legislative reform, of which there's been plenty. Sort of most countries in the region have done something from a legislative point of view, and that includes ADGM, DIFC, but also Saudi, Kuwait, everywhere. The list goes on. And most of that reform's been sort of positive drift towards a what you might call a westernized model, a sort of debtor in possession type model, which I think is favorable from a restructuring point of view. So that's the first sort of mega trend. I think the second one is the runners and riders have changed. So when I arrived, it was pretty much a big 4 magic circle environment, and it's now not. You know, the big 4 is still active, but the boutiques have arrived and the smaller law firms have arrived. And with that change, there has been a shift towards the chief restructuring officer as a concept, which again I think is a really good development. I've done a couple of those, and they're pretty sort of scary situations, but they're good fun as well. And I think the third big trend is the capital providers. So when I first got here, the market was dominated by the Western banks, the Barclays and Lloyds and RBSs. They packed up and pretty much went home following the global financial crisis, and the local banks sort of took over, and then they merged. So a lot fewer banks. And then more recently, the secondary debt market, people like Dominic have arrived, and that's creating an interesting series of opportunities as well. So,
yeah, I think what you can see in the secondary market at the moment is that first, the foreign banks who are based here, and now increasingly local banks too, are increasingly proactive at selling portfolios of non-performing exposures. In Europe, which is a core region for Fidera, you know, we are a primarily European investor. This is by now a pretty common pattern across all the key jurisdictions. And here we are starting to go through a couple of very large transactions between Dubai and Abu Dhabi where portfolios are being sold, which is a great trend, right? Ultimately, it allows people like us to come in and to follow some of these often enforcement-focused processes for a number of years to come, which may not necessarily make sense to a workout department of a bank, but may make a lot of sense to us having very long-term capital.
And Vikas, I guess, is it the same trend we're seeing regionally? Let's say this is the UAE, we've been talking about it. What about KSA? A lot of people are talking about as well the KSA market. Is it the same trend we're seeing?
In terms of yeah, absolutely. I think you know what you're saying in terms of you know both just the process. I think it's important to remember. You know, I've been probably the same time, Matthew, maybe a year or two more, but you know it's still a very new restructuring market, right, compared to many markets which have seen these for decades. So in that short journey of 10, 12 years since the big restructuring started kicking off here, it's still a very new market. But I think the very fact that I think we've made so much progress, we're talking about new money solutions, we're talking about banks getting organized, even bilateral banks, that we're seeing on cases, getting organized and getting restructurings done, bankruptcy courts that are being set up. And I think today, it's not uncommon to see, back to Dom's comment, about the solution. I think one of the previous panels were talking about from an amend extend to kind of thinking certainly something more stable.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll just maybe add is, there used to be a taboo around a process before, but I suppose as the market is maturing, I think a lot of people are using that as a implementation mechanism, which is, I think, is a sign of maturity in this market.
I would say, I think it is indeed evolving, and people are realizing the amend and extend is clearly not a permanent solution, and one needs to try and find a permanent solution. I don't think we're at a market stage where we're seeing lots of debt for equities. That's definitely not the case. Will it happen over time? Potentially, to find a more permanent solution to restructurings? Perhaps. Obviously, there are issues, particularly in Saudi Arabia. SAMA restricts the banks from taking equity, so there are more complexities over there. Over here, from a legislative perspective, it's a little bit easier. I think one reasonably recent development, which is quite helpful in getting restructurings executed, is the provision of new money in restructuring context, so that borrowers can actually negotiate restructurings on a stable platform, not on a burning platform, and particularly DIP financing, so debtor and possession financing. We've got one recent precedent in ADGM, another one onshore as well, and I think that is a very helpful element to restructurings. I think some of the key things which will be negotiated and are reasonably new over here are beyond just deviating from the absolute priority model and putting super senior paper in place. I think the concept of elevation rights is a relatively new concept to a lot of the banks over here, and people are getting their heads around it. Equally, equitization being part of that new money in DIP financings. So they're reasonably new concepts, so maybe Dom can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think having participated in both the NMC and the KBBO restructurings, where new money was provided in different contexts, of course, right? In the NMC ADGM context, it was in the context of the DOCA. In the KBBO EHG context, it was in the context of an onshore court ruling back in December last year, ratifying the provision of super senior new money. Untested grounds in both cases, right? But ultimately very positive experiences and huge breakthroughs. In our core jurisdictions, in other words, whenever we spend time in many of the Europe's 28 jurisdictions, these types of mechanisms, new money, elevation / roll-up, and then equitization are very common, right? That has become the bread and butter of insolvencies. Ultimately, a lot then comes down to the fairness of the distribution of these instruments and the appropriate mechanisms to ensure that everyone can participate over a certain period of time. Otherwise, of course, that can be a little bit more difficult, but ultimately, as long as you have a court-supervised process with court trustees who approach it with fairness, then there shouldn't be any issues there. We're not as far as seeing kind of up-tiering exchanges here outside of court processes. I'm sure that will come eventually. We see a lot of that in the United States. We see some of that in Europe. But I would say that the DIP-like provision here under both the onshore law and the offshore law is incredibly important to watch going forward. Ultimately, in many of these situations, you find lenders who have to provide funding into a situation which is complex from a process perspective, as well as from an operational turnaround perspective. So that has to be appropriately rewarded, and the combination of elevation and equitization can form the basis of that appropriate compensation for the risk that's being taken.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of things have been mentioned on the market. Definitely, it's a reflection about the changes that we're seeing in the market, the more complexities that we're seeing, the maturity of the market, which is definitely great to have. maybe I want to maybe let's dig down a bit on the corporate side, and I'll start maybe with you, Vikas, and if you can tell us, I guess, on the main challenges that corporates are facing from what you're seeing, I guess, in the market recently.
No, that's a very good point, right? So, I mean, if you think about the commentary that comes out about the fact that this region is somehow also sheltered because of, obviously, you know, where the price of oil is, and of course, because we're pegged to dollar in most of these economies. But if you think about some of the on-the-ground evidence, you know, clearly, I think most companies are facing cost escalations, right? I mean, the reality is how many of them are able to pass that on is unclear, but clearly that's a challenge. You know, globally, there's a war for talent. You know, it's becoming more expensive to get good talent, to attract talent. I think that's clearly a challenge. Because we're pegged to the dollar, we also have an interest rate rising environment. You know, interest rates are up 3.5% since the beginning of the year. And then if you think about the geopolitics around us, so many of the markets which were typically markets for many of the corporates are now shut. And that's just what it is. And then, you know, finally, you know, having a peg to dollar is fantastic, but also it impacts certain industries. So if you think about, you know, sectoral view, clearly contracting has struggled for a while. Healthcare maybe has seen a number of restructurings, trade variable. But if you think about some of the sectors have been, you know, getting a fillip because of, say, the Qatar World Cups, be it retail, F&B, hospitality. But, you know, the reality is things may move quickly. So come Q1, Q2 next year, things could look a bit different. And I think when we as advisors think about these situations, you know, the golden rule has got to be, as corporates start seeing signs, the earlier they go into a discussion, the more options they retain. Clearly, if they're seeing, you know, sales stagnating or costs increasing or cash flows becoming a challenge, it's good to start having those conversations, because, you know, something that could be a reset or refi could easily go into restructuring and remotely, but not completely exceptionally go into an insolvency. And I think that's kind of, so I think our general view is that there's a very good set of advice now on the ground. There's obviously a lot of solutions what Dom does. There are advisors who are specialized on both lender side, corporate side, but I think getting that help early is useful, because options are much more early stage.
Yes, indeed. And I guess, again, the corporates are going through some challenges. We always say, okay, you have to entertain, like you have to start proactively, get into a restructuring process. But there are challenges in a restructuring process as well. And maybe, Matthew, I see you nodding. So maybe if you could tell us, what are you seeing? What is kind of the main challenge that you can, if you are to pick, I guess, one main challenge in a restructuring process?
If I could only choose one, it's the alignment of stakeholders,
Yeah.
Which sort of touches on a couple of others as well, one of which is trust, and the lack of trust, and genuinely, what's the right word, justifiable lack of trust in many cases for some of the restructurings in this part of the world. So getting alignment between stakeholders who could be secured versus unsecured, could be national banks versus local banks, if you see what I mean. But also as between the sponsors and the banks. And this part of the world is challenging from an alignment point of view. So the second one, as I say, was trust. The third one is liquidity, because almost always a process will take a long period of time, and almost always there's going to be a liquidity requirement along the way. And whilst we've made big progress in the region in terms of mechanisms which can aid bringing in DIF financing, for example, it's still a long way to go in terms of the practices in the market. So yeah, I think the big one would be alignment of stakeholders.
If I just maybe add to that, I think so. The one other concept, just going back to Matthew's comment on alignment, is the fact that standstill as a concept is still, you know, relatively nascent here. So you have a lot of informal standstills that exist in this market, and I think that's kind of where that alignment piece becomes even more critical, because, you know, you are trying to get a fairly complex restructuring with a high level of complex stakeholders. So there is a high level of activity that happens around a restructuring because of some of those processes non-existent. And I think the reality is, you know, when I look at my colleagues on over here, we have to be also trying to get alignment, to ensure that behind the scenes there's a lot of informal activity going on to get all of these stakeholders marching in the same direction. It feels many times you're taking 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, pretty much on a and I'm looking at Naveen because there's something, we had a conversation this morning. So it feels that way, but I think as we see some of these processes getting more formalized, be it things like standstill, I think I'm hoping that helps bring a little bit more alignment than probably is today.
I think there are some basic ingredients to any restructuring, which if you're able to include those in the pot, you're going a long way, including starting early, having a COCOM, having a standstill in place, having a common information platform. If you have these very basic ingredients, you're already at a very good starting position. And unfortunately, in a lot of situations, this is not just a UAE comment, but more generally in a lot of situations, these things are often started too late because borrowers think that actually we'll get a refinancing even if it's in the 11th hour and at suboptimal terms, but I'll keep pushing that route rather than engaging on a restructuring. And I think moving to having parallel processes is going to be critical, thinking about the fact that we are clearly operating in more volatile market conditions. We have a poly crisis. We'll always have a poly crisis now, whether it's supply side shocks or higher inflation or higher base rates. Yes, the GCC to some degree is more insulated given where the oil price is, but we need to be cognizant that it will be impacted by some degree from the global recession. So I think for any borrower with a maturity which is sort of 18, 24 months out, that's really where you need to start thinking about commencing a process, a parallel process, whether it be engaging with your incumbent banks for an amend and extend, approaching other banks, and approaching funds as well. And people like Dom and others are playing over here or actually have offices on the ground. So it's I think it's an important pool of capital to be talking to.
I think that's spot on, and I think in the context of the onshore bankruptcy processes in the UAE, the stakeholder alignment is even more important, right? Because ultimately, in these processes, the shareholders or the debtors will be the one who will have to sign off on any restructuring plan solution that will be put in front of the court and then eventually up for a vote. So clearly, there's a need for a great degree of stakeholder alignment. In the ADGM, the situation is a bit different, and the beauty of the DOCA that we saw in NMC and the other frameworks used within ADGM is that you have great cram-down mechanisms and ultimately much more streamlined restructuring processes, and hopefully that's the path that the onshore insolvency framework over time also follows, because ultimately, yes, you always need to align your stakeholders, but there are certain limits to it, because ultimately the process can drag on for months and months, right, with erosion of value along the way. But I think the beauty of the situation is that we have an increasing number of advisors on the ground, all with great expertise, and we also have an increasing number of people like us. Fidera is currently in the process of launching our ADGM office, and we'll have 10 to 12 colleagues here, and all of them will be very focused on this region and working with our advisor friends here on making many of these stories a success.
I think banks are also part of the solution in getting comfortable with having a fund in the cap stack, whether it's a second lien, a fund coming in with a second lien, as opposed to just taking out the banks entirely. But a second lien or DIP financing, that type of rescue financing is absolutely critical to be able to either avoid a formal restructuring or provide the required financing in order to be able to exit a restructuring successfully.
Yeah, and I would highlight the importance of fairness in all of this, right? So, for example, in the context of KBBO EHG, where we provided the new money in December, we made sure that there was a period of 6 months that followed after we provided the new money that allowed the banks to decide whether they want to be a part of the new money solution or not. Ultimately, they have longer decision-making processes. Some of them need Sharia compliant documentation, and you have to accommodate all of that and be respectful of that, right? That's an important feature of any solution here.
Thank you. This is quite, I think, quite interesting and we start talking about the opportunities, I guess, we're seeing actually in the market. Is there other, maybe Matthew, Vikas, Naveen, and Dom, other opportunities where you're seeing there are challenges, as we said, but there is a bright future. We're seeing it. It's definitely the market is developing. So where do you see really the main opportunities? Dom, I feel like you have something in your mind.
Look, from an opportunity, I mean, for me, all of these challenges are ultimately opportunities, right? And
Yes.
you know, as Fidera, we work probably in, as I mentioned, nearly 30 different jurisdictions, going through complex restructuring processes in every single one of them. And every single one of these jurisdictions, whether you look at the UAE or it's France or Germany or the Netherlands, every single one of them is going through a constant process of evolution, right? There are mistakes being made, lessons are being learned, and there's this feedback loop which allows for the processes to become better and better. And I can see that a lot of this is happening here, even on the onshore side of things. You know, the competence of the judges who rule on bankruptcy cases is exponentially higher than it used to be. The proficiency of the trustees is improving at a fast pace. The insolvency code is constantly evolving. Even from the 2016 iteration, we've seen a couple of amendments which have been incredibly helpful, including on the new money provision side. So, you know, there's this constant evolution, open-mindedness here, we feel, to ultimately improve these processes, which I think is a great opportunity for us all.
If I just maybe take a sector view, so, you know, clearly, you know, while many parts of the world are struggling, you know, we are very fortunate because of everything that my co-panelists have said around was fueling growth here. So clearly contracting, taking that as a sector example, there's a lot of demand coming in, right? I mean, some of the giga projects, some of the developments in Abu Dhabi, there's a lot of activity happening. And I think what we're also seeing an opportunity right now for some of these large contractors to go and clear off some of the challenges they've had in the past so that they can get further liquidity to continue working on these projects. And I think that is also creating a massive amount of activity in the restructuring market. But going back to my other comment, you know, the earlier these things are dealt with, the more options people have on the table. And the best restructuring environment is one that deals with these topics early and not let legacy matters continue for 10, 12 years. We've seen those as well, right? So I think that's kind of the key recipe, I think.
So we do, taking construction is an interesting example. There are fantastic opportunities in that sector, right? But many of the players, the incumbent players, have stranded balance sheets, broken balance sheets that really are some way away from being resolved. And therefore there's a fantastic opportunity for the upstarts, if you see what I mean, the new entrants into traditional markets. It's not just construction, it could be many others. One of the key things I see as well at the moment is that COVID finally caught up with us in this region, or I think it's globally. That businesses shrank during the COVID time. They produce working capital whilst they're shrinking, and now markets are beginning to sort of be more accessible. They haven't got any working capital, and that's a real opportunity for providers of working capital. If I was sitting in Dom's shoes, I'd be very excited by this region and that issue at the moment.
I think there's some unique structures which people have come up with for these types of situations. So you take the contracting sector. There's a situation in Saudi Arabia now where lenders and the company have negotiated and agreed a perpetual structure, which for a business of this nature where it's extremely challenging to come up with a business plan, that may well indeed be the right solution over here. So I think it's great to see people thinking more creatively about these structures.
For sure. I mean, be it receivables finance, inventory financing, we see a lot of these structures being deployed across the region, actually, not just in the UAE in the last few quarters, and we are very excited about those opportunities.
Perfect. I think, look, we're running, I think, a bit out of time, but maybe I'll ask one final question. A single advice you could give to corporates, given there is a risk of recession. A lot of people are talking about it, whether it's happening or not. We never know. But what is a single piece of advice that you could give actually to corporates to navigate the upcoming period? I'll let you maybe take the role. Yeah, let's start with Matthew.
Start weatherproofing your portfolio. I mean,
Yeah.
whether the storm hits us in the way that the global economy is hit by the storm or not, I don't know. I doubt it. It probably won't be as bad here as elsewhere. But there'll certainly be some wind and some rain. Yeah. So start looking at your portfolio of assets in a way that identifies those which need to be waterproofed effectively for the storm.
I mean, if you take that further, I mean, given that we could be potentially getting into a cycle where there could be significant growth coming, right? I mean, going back to Matthew's comment, the earlier and the quicker they're prepared, the more they focus on the core and probably even look at divesting something that's non-core. And the earlier they're having conversations with banks, as partners with new money, I think the earlier they do that, the better they will be to capture that opportunity that's coming.
I agree with all the points, and I would just add contingency planning via understanding your documentation is important. So understanding what your baskets are. Are you actually able to dispose of assets? What can you use the proceeds for? Can you do a sale and lease back? Can you prime existing lenders? Understanding what you can do if things get more complex and you can't refi. I think it's critical to start doing that.
Yeah, I think the businesses should be encouraged to hire legal and financial advisors very early in the process. It will definitely make their lives easier going forward, and they're welcome to give Fidera a call as early as possible too.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed this panel as much as I did. Thank you, panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.